Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Morrison. The whisper you hear in the dark is not the wind. It is the language the past has chosen to speak with you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like so you don't get lost in the darkness. Now, the story begins. Get ready. The carousel of scorched echoes, the Ifrit in the rust. In the desolate outskirts of modern Ohio, where the skeletons of abandoned industries pierce the gray horizon, stood the Grand Horizon Fun Fair. Once a place of neon lights and laughter, it had been shuttered for 40 years. Its remains now a jagged graveyard of oxidized iron and peeling plastic. Julian, a professional urban explorer and a man of cold, empirical logic, arrived at the site with his high-definition cameras and thermal sensors. To Julian, the park was merely a collection of decaying materials. He viewed the local warnings about the Ferris wheel that turns without wind, or the static screams in the Hall of Mirrors, as echoes of a superstitious past. He was a man who trusted his lens and his logic until he reached the center of the park where a rusted carousel sat, radiating a heat that defied the laws of the freezing autumn night. The time was exactly 3:15 a.m. The ambient temperature was a biting 2 degrees Celsius. Yet as Julian approached the carousel, his digital thermal scanner began to flicker with impossible readings. 53 degrees Celsius, 91 degrees Celsius, 124 degrees Celsius. The air grew suffocatingly dense, saturated with the pungent scent of burnt sugar, ancient sulfur, and a sharp metallic aroma of blood that began to seep from the hollow eyes of the wooden horses. This must be a localized chemical reaction in the old machinery, Julian muttered, his lungs searing as he inhaled the blistering air. He watched in paralyzed disbelief as the shadows cast by the rusted pillars began to detach from the asphalt, coiling like serpentine vines of black ash around the base of the ride. When he reached out to steady himself against a metal support beam, he discovered his hand was fused to the iron by an invisible thermal force that charred his glove instantly. From the cracks in the carousel's floorboards, a thick black smoke began to pour, not rising, but swirling around Julian's waist like a chain of white-hot embers. From that oily shroud emerged a towering, terrifying figure woven from smokeless fire and shifting obsidian shadows. This was an Ifrit, a jinn of the most destructive lineage, who had been sealed beneath the foundations of this fairground centuries ago by a tribe that sought to imprison the breath of the desert within the cold earth. The weight of the rusting machinery and Julian's intrusion had fractured the seal of lead and salt that kept the entity in the silence of the iron. The Ifrit had no human face. Its head was a vortex of violet flames, and its eyes were two rifts of blue magma, pulsing with a fury accumulated over 1,000 years of imprisonment. Its presence was so overwhelming that the rusted gears of the carousel began to turn, shrieking with a sound that resembled a human choir in agony. The entity's magic manifested as a web of incandescent wires that erupted from the machinery, piercing Julian's jacket and weaving into his nervous system, connecting his flesh to the burning mechanical heart of the park. You sought to capture my cage in your box of glass, little witness of dust, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every lens in Julian's bag. But in this carnival, there is no exit. Your body shall be the new gear, where I pour my eternal fire upon this world of cold rain. The jinn initiated the liturgy of the scorched echo, a sorcery of absolute cruelty. It did not want Julian's immediate death. It needed his voice and his digital reach to lure others into the ruins. Julian's hands began to turn a stony grey, hardening into an amalgam of flesh, molten basalt, and internal fire. The Ifrit's magic was devouring his identity, replacing his memories of logic with the pure, searing hunger of the abyss. Now you shall be my operator in the rust, the entity hissed, extending a hand of blue flame that passed through Julian's chest, turning his heart into a smoldering coal powered by the void. In that instant, Julian's blood turned to boiling plasma, and his eyes flashed with a violet light. It was not death, but a transformation into a paranormal instrument of the jinn's will. The Ifrit had made him the herald of the grand horizon, a creature that would continue to haunt the park, but every flash of his camera would now be a beacon for the Ifrit's fire, destined to consume anyone who dared to step into the circle of the rust. The next morning, only Julian's empty camera bag was found at the entrance. However, those who pass the park at night now see a figure standing on the carousel, a man whose skin is waxen and from whom emanates a dry, unbearable heat. Julian no longer explores. He waits for the next visitor to feed the invisible Ifrit that now lives within his chest. The Iron Sepulchre, the Ifrit of the Ghost Line. In the desolate, sun-scorched plains of modern Nevada, where the horizon shimmered like a fractured mirror, lay the Rust Valley Graveyard, a final resting place for hundreds of decommissioned train cars. Elias, a freelance industrial historian and a man who believed only in what he could touch, measure, and document, arrived at the site to photograph a legendary 1920s Pullman car. To Elias, the world was a collection of cold facts and mechanical blueprints. He dismissed the local tales of the passenger in cabin 4 or the phantom heat that supposedly turned the steel into a furnace at night. He was a man of logic until he stepped inside the mahogany-lined corridor of the ancient wagon, and the air began to vibrate with a heat that didn't belong to the desert sun. The time was exactly 3:15 a.m. Outside, the desert night had cooled to a crisp 12 degrees Celsius. However, as Elias moved deeper into the wagon, the digital thermometer on his smartwatch began to climb at a terrifying pace. 55 degrees Celsius, 94 degrees Celsius, 126 degrees Celsius. The air grew suffocatingly dense, saturated with the pungent scent of scorched velvet, ancient sulfur, and a sharp metallic aroma of blood that began to seep from the brass rivets of the ceiling. "This is an impossible thermal pocket. The metal should be melting," Elias wheezed, his lungs searing as he inhaled the blistering air. He watched in paralyzed disbelief as the shadows cast by the window frames began to detach from the floor, coiling like serpentine vines of black ash around the velvet seats. When he reached for the emergency brake to steady himself, he discovered his hand was fused to the iron handle by an invisible thermal force that charred his skin instantly. From the vents beneath the floorboards, a thick black smoke began to pour, not rising, but swirling around Elias's waist like a chain of white-hot embers. From that oily shroud emerged a towering, terrifying figure woven from smokeless fire and shifting obsidian shadows. This was an Ifrit, a jinn of the most destructive lineage, who had been sealed within the iron frame of this wagon a century ago by a traveler who sought to transport the heart of the abyss across the continent. Elias's intrusion into the long-forgotten cabin 4 had fractured the seal of lead and mercury that kept the entity in the silence of the iron. The Ifrit had no human face. Its head was a vortex of violet flames, and its eyes were two rifts of blue magma pulsing with a fury accumulated over 100 years of imprisonment. Its presence was so overwhelming that the steel walls of the wagon began to glow a dull, dangerous red, and the glass windows shattered outward into the desert sand. The entity's magic manifested as a web of incandescent wires that erupted from the mahogany panels, piercing Elias's jacket and weaving into his nervous system, connecting his flesh to the burning mechanical ghost of the train. "You sought to document my cage, little clerk of dust," the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the very foundation of the graveyard. "But in this station, there are no more departures. Your body shall be the new engine where I pour my eternal fire upon this world of cold sand." The jinn initiated the liturgy of the scorched rail, a sorcery of absolute cruelty. It did not want Elias's immediate death. It needed his physical form to act as a conductor, turning the entire graveyard of hundreds of train cars into a massive, interconnected network of fire. Elias's hands began to turn a stony gray, hardening into an amalgam of flesh, molten basalt, and internal fire. The Ifrit's magic was devouring his identity, replacing his memories of history with the pure, searing hunger of the void. "Now you shall be my engineer in the rust," the entity hissed, extending a hand of blue flame that passed through Elias's chest, turning his heart into a smoldering coal powered by the abyss. In that instant, Elias's blood turned to boiling plasma, and his eyes flashed with a violet light. It was not death, but a transformation into a paranormal instrument of the jinn's will. The Ifrit had made him the conductor of the ghost line, a creature that would walk the corridors of the rusted wagons, ensuring that anyone who wandered into the graveyard would be lured into cabin 4 to feed the invisible Ifrit that now lived within his chest. The next morning, only Elias's camera was found on the tracks, its plastic casing melted into a puddle. However, those who drive past the Rust Valley graveyard at night now see a single window in the 1920s Pullman car glowing with an intense violet light. Elias no longer takes photos. He stands at the window, his waxen skin shimmering with heat, waiting for the next passenger to board his train of eternal fire. The static mirror of room 404. The city of Chicago never truly sleeps. It merely vibrates with a low electric hum that masks the sounds of things that shouldn't exist. Elias, a cynical investigative journalist known for debunking haunted urban legends, stood before the heavy oak door of room 404 in the Blackwood Heights Hotel. The building was a relic of the 1920s, now surrounded by gleaming skyscrapers, looking like a rotted tooth in a mouth of chrome. Rumor had it that room 404 was a dead zone, not just for cell service, but for reality itself. Legend spoke of a guest in the 1970s, an occultist who attempted to bridge the gap between ancient ritual and modern frequency. Since then, anyone who stayed in the room for more than 3 hours claimed to hear voices coming from the television, even when it was unplugged. Elias checked his watch. 11:15 p.m. He set up his recording equipment, a high-frequency microphone, and a thermal camera. Logic is the only light in the dark, he whispered to his recorder, a mantra he used to settle his nerves. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air became thick, tasting like copper and ozone. Elias noticed his laptop screen flickering, lines of ancient Aramaic script bleeding through his Word document. He tried to shut it down, but the keys felt like they were burning his fingertips. Suddenly, the old CRT television in the corner, an antique the hotel kept for aesthetic reasons, burst into life. There was no image, only grey static, but the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't white noise. It was a rhythmic, guttural chanting. "Who's there?" Elias demanded, grabbing his camera. Through the thermal lens, the room was cold, almost blue. But in the reflection of the TV screen, he saw a figure standing directly behind him. He spun around, but the space was empty. When he looked back at the screen, the figure was closer. It was a jinn, but not one of smoke and fire. This was a creature of the modern age, a shadow woven from electromagnetic waves and jagged digital fragments. Its eyes were two dead white pixels, and its skin looked like shifting television static. "You seek the truth behind the signal," the jinn hissed, its voice echoing through Elias's own smartphone, which was sitting on the nightstand. "But the truth is a frequency you cannot survive." Elias felt a sharp, agonizing pull in his chest. The jinn wasn't just haunting the room. It was feeding on the electrical impulses of his nervous system. He tried to reach for the door, but his legs collapsed. The room began to warp, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal not wood and plaster, but endless scrolls of glowing, cursed code. "I am the Ifrit of the airwaves," the entity proclaimed, its form expanding until it filled the entire room. "For centuries we waited in the desert winds. Now we live in your satellites, your fiber optics, and your dreams." Elias realized with a jolt of horror that the occultist from the 70s hadn't died. He had been converted into a carrier signal. The jinn needed a physical anchor, a mind to process the vast, chaotic data of the spirit realm into the human world. The thermal camera fell to the floor, capturing one last image. Elias's body becoming translucent, his veins glowing with a violet electric light. He screamed, but the sound that came out was a burst of digital interference. His consciousness was being shredded, uploaded into a void where time was measured in nanoseconds of agony. At 3 a.m., the hotel manager found the room empty. The equipment was all there, perfectly intact. The only thing out of place was the television. It was still on, showing a single, frozen frame of static. If one looked closely at the screen, they could see a face pressed against the glass from the inside. A man with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth open in a silent, distorted cry. Elias had found his story, but he would never write it. He was now part of the signal, a ghost in the machine, waiting for the next guest to check in and tune to the wrong channel. The Orchard of Ash, the Ifrit of the Midnight Produce. In the neon-drenched suburbs of modern Los Angeles, where the city never truly sleeps and the smog chokes the stars, stood a small family-owned grocery store named Gaia's Harvest. Marcus, a night manager driven by strict efficiency and a cynical worldview, was in charge of the graveyard shift. To Marcus, the world was a series of inventory counts and shelf rotations. He dismissed the local whispers of the breathing vines, or the way the temperature plummeted, or spiked near the back of the store without explanation. He was a man of the modern age until a nameless delivery truck arrived at 3 a.m., leaving behind a single wooden crate of fruit that pulsed with a heat no refrigeration could subdue. The time was exactly 3:15 a.m. The produce section was climate-controlled at a crisp 14 degrees Celsius. Marcus stood alone, prying open the lid of the mysterious crate. As he reached in to touch a piece of fruit that resembled a blackened pomegranate, the digital sensors above the misters began to malfunction, their readouts suddenly screaming 52 degrees Celsius, 88 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Celsius. The air grew suffocatingly dense, saturated with the smell of scorched earth, ancient sulfur, and a sharp metallic aroma of blood that began to drip from the over-ripened peaches on the nearby display. This is an electrical surge in the cooling racks. The whole floor is going to ignite. Marcus rasped, his lungs searing as he inhaled the blistering air. He watched in paralyzed disbelief as the shadows cast by the hanging scales began to detach from the floor, coiling like serpentine vines of black ash around his ankles. When he tried to pull his hand away, he discovered his fingers were fused to the leathery skin of the black fruit by an invisible thermal force. From the cracks in the linoleum floor, a thick black smoke began to pour. Not rising, but swirling around Marcus like a chain of white-hot embers. From that organic shroud emerged a towering, terrifying figure woven from smokeless fire and shifting obsidian shadows. This was an Ifrit, a jinn of the most malevolent lineage, who had been sealed beneath the ancient groves of this land centuries ago by a shaman who sought to imprison the fever of the soil. Marcus's act of uncovering the crate had shattered the seal of clay and blood that kept the entity in the silence of the harvest. The Ifrit had no human face. Its head was a vortex of violet flames, and its eyes were two rifts of blue magma, pulsing with a fury accumulated over 1,000 years. Its presence was so overwhelming that the glass cases of the frozen food aisle began to shatter, and the water in the spray misters turned into scalding steam instantly. The entity's magic manifested as a web of incandescent roots that erupted from the crate, piercing Marcus's uniform and weaving into his nervous system, connecting his flesh to the ancient, burning hunger of the jinn. You sought to profit from the fruits of my prison, little merchant of rot. The Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that made the grocery shelves rattle until the cans exploded. But in this market, there is no sustenance for the soul. Your body shall be the new soil, where I pour my eternal fire upon this world of plastic and steel. The jinn initiated the liturgy of the scorched harvest, a sorcery of absolute cruelty. It did not want Marcus's immediate death. It needed his presence in the store to lure the late-night travelers into its trap. Marcus's skin began to turn a stony gray, hardening into an amalgam of flesh, molten basalt, and internal fire. The Ifrit's magic was devouring his identity, replacing his thoughts of profit with the pure, searing hunger of the desert shadows. Now you shall be my gardener on the surface, the entity hissed, extending a hand of blue flame that passed through Marcus's chest, turning his heart into a smoldering coal powered by the abyss. In that instant, Marcus's blood turned to boiling sap, and his eyes flashed with a violet light. It was not death, but a transformation into a paranormal instrument of the jinn's will. The Ifrit had made him the vendor of the ash, a creature that would continue to stock the shelves of Gaia's harvest. But every piece of produce he touched would now carry a fragment of the Ifrit's fire, destined to consume the buyer from within. The next morning, the day shift found Marcus standing by the registers. He looked almost normal, save for a deathly waxen pallor and the fact that the air around him constantly shimmered with a dry, unbearable heat. Marcus no longer spoke. He simply scanned items with a hand that left scorch marks on the packaging. The Ifrit had not left. It lived within the manager, turning every transaction into a herald of its slow, invisible, and eternal fire. The ash of Oak Haven, the Ifrit in the vanished valley. In the rugged, fog-shrouded mountains of modern Oregon, there existed a cartographic anomaly known as Oak Haven. To the world, it was a ghost town that had vanished from every satellite map in the late 90s. Elias, a high-altitude drone surveyor and a man of uncompromising empirical data, was hired by a private firm to locate the physical coordinates of the valley. To Elias, the world was a grid of elevation points and thermal signatures. He dismissed the local whispers about the village of smoke or the legends of a fire that consumed shadows instead of wood. He was a man of the lens and the sensor, until he stepped into a valley where the air itself began to shimmer with a heat that defied the laws of nature. The time was exactly 3:15 a.m. The mountain air was a crisp 4 degrees Celsius. Yet as Elias crossed the invisible perimeter of the village ruins, the sensors on his handheld unit began to scream. 55 degrees Celsius, 92 degrees Celsius, 128 degrees Celsius. The air grew suffocatingly dense, saturated with the pungent scent of scorched pine, ancient sulfur, and a sharp metallic aroma of blood that began to rise from the very soil where the village well once stood. This is a massive subterranean thermal pocket. The crust must be thinning, Elias wheezed, his skin blistering as he inhaled the searing air. He watched in paralyzed disbelief as the shadows of the skeletal, burnt-out houses began to detach from the charred wood, coiling like serpentine vines of black ash around his ankles. When he reached out to steady himself against a blackened fence post, his hands were fused to the wood by an invisible thermal force that charred his gloves instantly. From the center of the village square, a thick, ink-like smoke began to pour, not rising, but swirling around Elias's waist like a chain of white-hot embers. From that shroud emerged a towering, terrifying figure, woven from smokeless fire and shifting obsidian shadows. This was an Ifrit, a jinn of the most destructive lineage, who had been sealed beneath Oak Haven centuries ago by a coven that sought to imprison the breath of the sun. Elias's modern presence and electronic frequencies had fractured the seal of lead and mercury that kept the entity in the silence of the vanished. The Ifrit had no human face. Its head was a vortex of violet flames, and its eyes were two rifts of blue magma, pulsing with a fury accumulated over 1,000 years. Its presence was so overwhelming that the drone hovering above began to melt midair, falling like a rain of molten plastic. The entity's magic manifested as a web of incandescent wires that erupted from the ground, piercing Elias's tactical gear and weaving into his nervous system, connecting his flesh to the ancient, burning hunger of the jinn. You sought to map the void of my prison, little architect of glass, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that made the very marrow in Elias's bones begin to boil. But in this valley, there is no path for the soul. Your body shall be the new coordinate where I pour my eternal fire upon this world of cold mist. The jinn initiated the liturgy of the vanishing pulse, a sorcery of absolute cruelty. It intended to use Elias as a living bridge to cross back into the physical world. Elias's skin began to turn a stony gray, hardening into an amalgam of flesh and molten basalt. However, the end took a terrifyingly different turn. Elias, realizing he could not escape, utilized his drone's emergency override. A high-frequency burst designed to scramble signals. Instead of killing the Ifrit, the frequency shattered the boundary between the physical and the ethereal. Elias did not become a vessel. He became a static wraith. His consciousness fused with the very air of the valley, turning him into a living, burning fog. The next morning, Oak Haven appeared on the satellite maps again, but it was no longer a ruins. It was a shimmering, heat-distorted mirage. Elias, now a being of pure, thermal energy and data, stood at the entrance of the valley. He didn't serve the Ifrit, nor was he human. He was a sentinel of fire who now erased anyone who entered the valley, turning them into lines of code and ash to feed his new, eternal hunger. The village hadn't just returned. It had become a hunting ground where Elias and the Ifrit practiced a new kind of digital alchemy. The husk of hollow graves, the Ifrit in the rotting barn. In the desolate plains of modern Kansas, where the wind whispers through the dying corn stalks like 1,000 restless ghosts, stood the Miller farmstead. At the edge of the property, leaning precariously against the crimson sunset, was the old North barn. Elias, a structural consultant with a penchant for historical demolition and a heart as cold as the steel of his measuring tape, was hired to clear the land for a new interstate highway. To Elias, the barn was nothing more than a liability of rotting timber, rusted nails, and termite-infested hay. He dismissed the local townspeople's warnings about the fever in the hay or the phantom warmth that supposedly radiated from the hand-carved symbols on the central pillar. He was a man of blueprints and industrial saws, until a floorboard snapped beneath his weight in the deepest part of the hayloft, revealing a hidden cellar that glowed with a heat that defied the laws of the physical world. The time was exactly 3:15 a.m. The barn's interior, despite the freezing midnight air of the Great Plains, reached a sweltering 62 degrees Celsius, 99 degrees Celsius, 127 degrees Celsius. Elias stood alone in the dark, his heavy-duty flashlight flickering as the temperature readout on his digital tablet began to bubble and melt. The air grew suffocatingly dense, saturated with the pungent scent of scorched grain, ancient sulfur, and a sharp metallic aroma of blood that began to ooze from the very grain dust floating in the air. "This is a spontaneous hay combustion. The barn is going to ignite," Elias rasped, his lungs searing as he inhaled the blistering, dust-filled air. He watched in paralyzed disbelief as the shadows cast by the timber rafters began to move independently, coiling like serpentine vines of black ash around the support beams of the loft. When he tried to climb down the ladder, he discovered his palms were fused to the wooden rungs by an invisible thermal force that charred his skin instantly. From the cracks in the cellar below, a thick black smoke began to pour, not rising toward the roof, but swirling around Elias's waist like a chain of white-hot embers. From that jagged shroud emerged a towering, terrifying figure, woven from smokeless fire and shifting obsidian shadows. This was an Ifrit, a jinn of the most destructive lineage, who had been sealed within that cellar eons ago by a tribe that sought to imprison the fever of the parched earth. Elias's weight had shattered the seal of bone and dried clay that kept the entity in the silence of the hollow graves. The Ifrit had no human face. Its head was a vortex of violet flames, and its eyes were two rifts of blue magma pulsing with a fury accumulated over 10,000 years of imprisonment. Its presence was so overwhelming that the dry hay around it began to turn into fine, glowing ash without a single spark of flame. The entity's magic manifested as a web of incandescent veins that erupted from the wood, piercing Elias's denim jacket and weaving into his nervous system, connecting his flesh to the burning, forgotten agony of the earth's fever. "You sought to dismantle my prison of rot, little creature of ash," the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that made the wooden barn groan as if it were screaming. "But in this stable, there is no escape for the living. Your body shall be the new husk where I pour my eternal fire upon this world of wind and dust." The jinn initiated the liturgy of the scorched pulse, a sorcery of absolute cruelty. It did not want Elias's immediate death. It needed his physical form to carry the fire across the plains. Elias's hands began to turn a stony gray, hardening into an amalgam of flesh, molten basalt, and internal fire. The Ifrit's magic was devouring his identity, replacing his engineering logic with the pure, searing hunger of the abyss. "Now you shall be my spark in the storm," the entity hissed, extending a hand of blue flame that passed through Elias's chest, turning his heart into a smoldering coal powered by the void. In that instant, Elias's blood turned to boiling lava, and his eyes flashed with a violet light. It was not death, but a transformation into a paranormal instrument of the jinn's will. The Ifrit had made him the harvester of the hollow graves, a creature that would continue to walk the Kansas plains. However, instead of disappearing into the night, Elias stood perfectly still as the sun rose. When the demolition crew arrived at dawn, they found the barn standing perfectly intact, but cold as ice. Elias greeted them with a wide, fixed smile and eyes that looked like cooling embers. He invited them inside, his voice now a perfect imitation of their own, leading them toward the cellar where the fire waited to be shared. The Ifrit had not just taken a host, it had built a trap, using Elias's face to gather more souls for its Ebedi, eternal feast. The static beneath the signal. The flickering fluorescent lights of the 24-hour laundromat in a desolate corner of New Jersey hummed with a frequency that made Sarah's teeth ache. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the world felt thin, like a worn-out piece of fabric ready to tear. Sarah, a night shift nurse, sat on a plastic bench, watching her clothes spin in Machine 12. She was alone, or so she thought, until the old television mounted in the corner, a relic from the 90s, hissed to life. There was no cable connected to it, no antenna, just a screen full of gray, swarming static. From the white noise, a sound emerged. It wasn't the sound of a broadcast. It was the sound of a heavy, rhythmic breathing, amplified through the blown-out speakers. Sarah frowned, looking around the empty room. Suddenly, the static on the screen began to shift. forming the shape of a hand. A long, spindly hand with too many joints, pressing against the glass from the inside. "Help me," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the TV. It came from the washing machine. Sarah stood up, her heart jumping. She approached machine 12. Inside, her clothes were no longer spinning. Instead, the drum was filled with a thick, oily black liquid that smelled like scorched copper and ancient graves. A face pressed against the circular glass of the washer. It was a face she recognized. Her younger brother, Jason, who had vanished 3 years ago near an abandoned radio tower. "Jason?" she gasped, her hands trembling as she touched the glass. The face in the machine distorted, its jaw unhinging unnaturally wide. "He is not Jason anymore," a new voice boomed, vibrating the very floorboards beneath her feet. "He is the copper. He is the wire. He is the feed." The laundromat's lights turned a violent, bruised purple. Shadows detached themselves from the walls and began to crawl toward her like ink spilled on silk. From the corner of her eye, Sarah saw a figure standing by the folding table. It was tall, impossibly tall, wrapped in a suit made of flickering television screens. Its head was a mass of shifting smoke and burning embers. This was a jinn of the New Age, a marid of the airwaves. "I am Balthazar," the entity spoke, its voice a collage of 1,000 different radio fragments. "The old desert sands were too quiet. I preferred the hum of your cities, the electricity of your fear. Your brother tried to listen to the frequencies he wasn't meant to hear. Now he belongs to the static." "Let him go," Sarah screamed, grabbing a heavy metal detergent bottle to smash the glass. "A soul for a soul," Balthazar hissed. "The signal requires a battery. The machine needs a ghost. If you want him back, you must step into the frequency." Suddenly, the door of machine 12 flew open. The black liquid didn't spill out. It surged forward like a living tongue, wrapping around Sarah's ankles. She felt a coldness so intense it felt like burning. The television screen in the corner began to glow with a blinding light, showing images of her own memories, being pulled out of her brain and converted into digital data. She realized then that this wasn't just magic. It was a parasitic evolution. The jinn had found a way to inhabit the very infrastructure of the modern world. Every cell tower, every router, every screen was a portal for them to enter. "I won't let you," Sarah grunted, reaching for her smartphone in her pocket. She remembered an old piece of folklore her grandmother had whispered, that these beings of fire could be grounded. She didn't have a magic circle, but she had something else. She initiated a high-frequency, emergency broadcast signal on her phone. A burst of raw data meant to overload a receiver. She jammed the phone into the center of the black liquid surging from the machine. The effect was instantaneous. Balthazar let out a screech that sounded like 1,000 modems dying at once. The television screen shattered. The black liquid began to evaporate into foul-smelling steam. For a second, Jason's hand reached out from the machine, solid and warm. Sarah grabbed it, pulling with all her might. But the jinn was faster. The static from the shattered TV jumped like a spark of lightning, hitting Sarah directly in the chest. She felt her consciousness being torn apart, shredded into bits and bytes. The next morning, a customer walked into the laundromat. Everything was back to normal, except for machine 12, which was out of order. On the floor lay a smartphone. Its screen cracked. If the customer had looked closer at the static on the still flickering corner TV, they might have seen two figures, a girl and a boy, wandering in a grey, endless wasteland of white noise. Sarah had saved her brother from the machine, but in the exchange, they were both now part of the signal, waiting for the next person to tune into the wrong frequency. The digital grimoire of Blackwood Apartment. In the heart of modern-day Chicago, where the skyscrapers pierced the clouds like jagged teeth, lived a young software developer named Julian. He lived in apartment 4B of the Blackwood complex, a building that was sleek, glass-fronted, and modern, yet felt unnervingly cold regardless of the central heating. Julian was a man of logic and code, but he had a side hobby that bordered on the obsessive, scouring the dark web for lost digital files, rumored data fragments from the dawn of the internet that supposedly contained ancient wisdom. One Tuesday night, while a thunderstorm rattled the reinforced windows, Julian stumbled upon a file titled Solomon_exe.zip. It was hidden behind layers of encrypted firewalls that seemed to pulse with a faint, violet light on his monitor. Being a hacker at heart, Julian spent hours bypassing the security. When the file finally unzipped, it didn't contain code or text. It was a single, high-definition video of a spinning geometric seal, accompanied by a low-frequency audio track that sounded like a choir of voices whispering in a language that predated humanity. As the audio played through his high-end speakers, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and scorched earth. Julian's smart home system began to malfunction. The lights flickered in a rhythmic pattern, 3 short, 3 long, and the temperature on his digital thermostat plummeted to freezing, despite the display reading 30 degrees Celsius. "Computer, stop playback," Julian commanded, his voice trembling. The system didn't respond. Instead, the geometric seal on his screen began to glow with a blinding white-hot intensity. Suddenly, the pixels on the monitor started to bleed. Black, ink-like fluid dripped from the bottom of the screen, pooling on his mahogany desk. Julian backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. From the pool of digital ink, a hand emerged. It was long, slender, and composed of shifting shadows and static, as if it were a glitch in reality itself. A figure rose from the desk, tall and terrifying. It was a djinn of the Ifrit class, but it had adapted to the modern world. Its body was a mass of flickering data and smokeless flame, its eyes 2 glowing blue orbs that resembled LED lights. This was the weaver of the web, an ancient entity that had found a new way to enter the physical realm through the world's interconnected servers. "You have executed the command," the djinn spoke. Its voice was a terrifying mix of 1,000 distorted radio frequencies. "The pact of the old world is now a digital contract, signed with your IP address and sealed with your curiosity." Julian grabbed his smartphone, intending to call for help, but the device grew searing hot in his hand. The screen displayed a single message: "Transferring soul. 45% complete." "What do you want?" Julian gasped, falling to his knees as the shadows in the room began to coil around his limbs like living cables. "Energy," the Ifrit hissed. "In the old days, we took the breath from the lungs. Now, we take the signal from the nerves. You sought the power of the ancients in a machine of silicon. You forgot that we were the ones who taught the first mages how to write the code of the universe." The djinn leaned closer, its face a blur of static. Julian felt a sharp, electrical sting at the base of his skull. His vision began to pixelate. He saw his own apartment dissolving into lines of green code, fading into a vast dark void. He realized too late that the Solomon_EXE file was a trap, a modern-day trap for a modern-day seeker. The jinn wasn't just in his room, it was now in his network, flowing through the wires of the entire building. Outside, the neighbors heard nothing. Inside apartment 4B, the lights suddenly went out. The only sound was the hum of a computer fan cooling a system that was now running at impossible speeds. The next morning, the building manager found the apartment empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no Julian. The only thing left was Julian's laptop, sitting open on the desk. On the screen, a new screensaver was running. A high-definition image of a young man trapped behind a glass wall, his hands pressed against the screen in a silent digital scream. As the manager reached out to close the laptop, his own smartphone vibrated in his pocket. A notification appeared. New file received, Solomon_EXE.zip. Would you like to open? The jinn had found its next node. The ancient fire was now in the wire, and it was hungry for more. The Whispering Ink of Malachor. The year was 1642, and the city of Prague was a labyrinth of cobblestones and shadows, cloaked in a fog that smelled of wood smoke and old parchment. Deep within the Jewish quarter, hidden behind a heavy door reinforced with iron bands, lived Master Alaric, a man whose eyes had grown dim from reading forbidden scrolls. Alaric was not a common scholar. He was a binder of spirits, a man who sought to trap the ancient powers of the desert within the confines of ink and paper. For years, Alaric had pursued the legend of the ink of the jinn, a substance said to be brewed from the charred remains of 1,000 cursed amulets and the essence of a captured Marid. He believed that by using this ink to write a specific spell, he could command the very forces of life and death, bringing his young daughter back from the cold embrace of the grave. On a night when the moon was strangled by thick clouds, Alaric finally completed his brew. The ink in the vial didn't sit still. It swirled with a violent, oily violet hue, pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. He laid out a fresh sheet of vellum, made from the hide of a beast that had never seen the sun. Beside him sat Silas, a young apprentice who trembled so fiercely that the candles on the desk flickered. "Master," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "The air, it tastes of copper. We must stop. This is not the magic of the heavens." Alaric ignored him. His hand, gnarled and spotted with age, dipped the quill into the pulsating ink. As soon as the tip touched the parchment, the room went silent. Not a silence of peace, but a silence of total vacuum. The quill moved of its own accord, scratching symbols that glowed with a sickening sulphurous light. "I call upon the dweller of the smokeless flame," Alaric chanted, his voice deepening into a resonant baritone that shook the floorboards. "I offer the ink as a vessel and the parchment as a contract. Bring her back." Suddenly, the ink began to bleed off the page. It didn't drip. It slithered like 1,000 tiny obsidian vipers. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves and rushed toward the center of the desk. A figure began to rise, a towering entity of shifting smoke and burning embers. This was a jinn of the ancient class, an ifrit whose name had been stricken from all holy books. The ifrit's eyes were not eyes at all, but windows into a furnace of eternal suffering. It didn't speak with a mouth. It spoke through the ink that had now covered Alaric's hands, seeping into his pores. "You seek to trade a soul for a soul," the jinn hissed, a sound like a forest fire consuming a village. "But the ink requires a pen that never dries. You have called me from the void, little man, but you did not provide a cage strong enough to hold a god." Silas tried to flee, but the shadows at the door solidified into spears of darkness, pinning his cloak to the wood. He watched in horror as the ink on Alaric's hands began to turn into actual metal, heavy and cold. The spell of resurrection was not bringing a girl back to life. It was pulling Alaric into the realm of the dead to take her place. "The contract is signed in your marrow," the jinn roared. The room erupted in a whirlwind of violet fire. The vellum on the desk burst into flames that did not consume the paper, but burned the very air around it. Alaric's body began to wither, his skin turning into the same grey vellum he had used for his spell. His eyes turned into pools of ink, and his last scream was muffled by the black fluid filling his throat. The jinn leaned over the dying scholar, its smoky hand reaching into Alaric's chest. It pulled out a glowing, flickering spark, Alaric's soul, and dropped it into the ink vial. The violet liquid instantly turned a calm, deep black. "The ink is ready for the next fool," the Ifrit whispered. By morning, the fog in Prague had lifted, but the workshop remained silent. When the city guards finally broke down the door, they found Silas catatonic, huddled in a corner, pointing at a desk that was completely empty except for a single vial of black ink and a quill. Master Alaric was nowhere to be found. However, on the wall, a new portrait had appeared. A mural of an old man with ink-stained hands, his face frozen in an expression of eternal regret. The ink of Malakor sat on the shelf, waiting for the next seeker of forbidden knowledge to dip their quill and sign their own death warrant. The jinn was gone, but its scent, the smell of ozone and burnt hair, remained in the wood. A silent warning to those who dare to play God with the spirits of the fire. The Crimson Ledger of the Damned. In the frost-bitten mountains of the north, centuries before the first steam engine hissed, there stood an abbey that was not on any pilgrim's map. It was the Abbey of St. Lazarus, a place built not for prayer, but for containment. Its walls were made of black granite, and its monks were silent men who had sewn their own lips shut with silver thread. They were the keepers of the Crimson Ledger, a book bound in the skin of a king and written with the ink of 1,000 broken oaths. Julian was a young scholar from a distant university, sent by a desperate nobleman to retrieve a specific spell from the ledger. He believed that magic was merely a forgotten science, a series of equations that the world had misplaced. He arrived at the abbey on a night when the stars seemed to shiver in the sky. The silent monks led him to the deepest cellar, where the air tasted of copper and ancient dust. In the center of the vault sat the ledger. It didn't just lay there. It seemed to throb with a slow, heavy heartbeat. The monks handed him a quill made from the bone of a vulture and pointed to a blank page. "To read the past, you must write the future," a voice whispered in his mind. It wasn't the monks. It was the book itself. Julian opened the ledger. As he turned the pages, he saw names he recognized, generals, queens, and philosophers. But as he looked closer, he realized their names were shifting. Their histories were being rewritten in real time. He found the spell he sought, a ritual to summon a companion of the smoke, a jinn of the ghoul class, known for its ability to grant any wish related to the physical world, but at the cost of the summoner's shadow. Driven by a hunger for fame, Julian ignored the growing cold in the room. He began the incantation. He traced the symbols with his fingers, feeling the parchment burn his skin. Suddenly, the shadows in the cellar began to pool together, rising like ink from the floor. A figure emerged, gaunt, tall, with skin like grey ash and eyes that flickered with the sickly green light of a decaying forest. "You have called for a servant," the jinn hissed, its breath smelling of wet earth and old graves. "But look behind you, little scholar. What have you traded?" Julian turned and gasped. His shadow was gone, but it wasn't just missing. It had been pulled into the crimson ledger. On the page where he had been reading, a new illustration was forming. A perfect, dark silhouette of himself, trapped behind the ink. "The magic of the ledger is simple," the ghoul whispered, leaning closer until its sharp, needle-like teeth were inches from Julian's ear. "It provides power, but it requires an anchor. You wanted the spell to save your master's life, but the book requires a life to replace it. Death is a debt that must always be balanced." Julian tried to close the book, but the pages were like iron. The ghoul's hand, cold as a winter tomb, clamped down on his shoulder. Julian felt his pulse slowing, his skin turning the color of parchment. He looked at his hands and saw thin red lines of ink beginning to crawl up his veins. He wasn't just dying, he was being transcribed. "No!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "I can pay another way. I have gold. I have secrets." The jinn laughed, a sound like dirt falling on a coffin lid. "Secrets are the food of the ledger. And you, Julian, are the greatest secret of all." As the last of his strength faded, Julian saw the silent monks returning. They weren't there to save him. They were there to witness the completion of the entry. One of the monks took the vulture bone quill and, with a steady hand, wrote Julian's name in the book. As the ink dried, Julian's physical body dissolved into a cloud of black soot. The ghoul vanished back into the smoke, its hunger sated for another century. The cellar returned to its copper-tasting silence. The monks closed the crimson ledger and placed it back on its pedestal. On the last page, there was now a detailed account of a young scholar who had traveled across the world to find a miracle, only to become a warning. The book throbbed once, a heavy, satisfied heartbeat, and waited. For in the world of the paranormal and the ancient, there is no such thing as a free gift, only a loan that is eventually collected in blood, soul, and ink.